Let's take a look at our main exposure controls here for a moment, as we're going to dive into one of them specifically. Now, our three major controls that are part of every exposure we make with our camera are ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Very briefly, ISO is how sensitive the sensor is. Shutter speed is a control of time, how long we're letting the light hit the sensor, and aperture is a control of intensity or volume. And these things balance each other out. Let's talk about ISO though specifically. What ISO does is it lets us adjust the sensitivity of the sensor for different lighting conditions. When we have more light, we don't need the sensor to be so sensitive. We can shoot it in a lower sensitivity when we have plenty of light. When we don't have very much light, then we may need to make the sensor more sensitive by raising the ISO. So we use a high sensitivity for low light situations. And generally we're setting the ISO based on our lighting condition first. Now why do we do this? Well, in a low light situation, we don't want to end up with a slow shutter speed and risk what you see here, which is camera shake. Now this is very severe camera shake. Usually it's not this bad, but that kind of movement of the camera over a slow shutter speed creates a blurred picture. It's not blurred because of focus, it's blurred because the camera has moved because our hands are not perfectly steady. Now, for this reason, we will increase the ISO in low light situations so that we can get a shutter speed that's fast enough to keep the image sharp. But ISO has a consequence. The higher we make the ISO, the more graininess or noise we get in the image, and that interferes with how well we can read details. Now these three slices of a magnified part of an image are all the same total resolution, but when shot at a low ISO, we can make out very fine details like the hairs in this eyebrow. You can even see this very fine hair in front of the face. At 800, we get a little bit more noise, not so easy to read these things, and at 1600, we get a lot more noise, and it's very difficult to read these things. How much noise you get, of course, depends on the quality of your camera and the quality of the sensor. A pro-level camera will have less noise at 1600, let's say, than an entry model camera would. Generally speaking, we set our ISO according to our lighting conditions. If there is plenty of sun out, if it's a sunny day, then we're talking about 100, 200, maybe up to 400, depending. If there's maybe a shady situation or it's like slightly overcast, we might move up into the 400 to 800 range. If we are on a really cloudy day, a really dark cloudy day, then we might be in the 800 to maybe 1000 range or 1250 range. If we are indoors, even in a fairly brightly lit room, we're probably going to be up around 1250 to 1600. And if it is nighttime or we're in a dimmer room, then we probably want 1600 or even higher. Your cameras typically go at least to 3200, probably more to 6400 for most of you. Now, anytime we get up above 800, we're thinking about noise. We tend to incur more and more noise as we get higher than that. So generally speaking, we try to keep the ISO on the low side as long as we can still get the shutter speed we need to in order to have a sharp image. The next control or setting I want to talk about is white balance. White balance is a setting that we can adjust to correct for the inherent color in different light sources, otherwise known as color temperature. Here you're looking at a room that is lit by incandescent bulbs, what are also known as tungsten bulbs for the filament that burns inside them. Those tungsten lights have a very orange color. If you were to photograph the scene, as you see here on daylight setting, then the scene looks really orange. If you go outside into daylight, daylight is a more neutral to slightly cool color, but if you shoot it with the wrong setting, in this case tungsten, the scene looks overly blue. Now, this is how the scene should look with the proper white balance. Here set for daylight. Another way that you might get close to this is if you shoot on auto, and what auto does is it detects what the camera feels is the brightest, whitest thing in the scene, let's say this guy's hat, and it balances according to that. Sometimes that works pretty well, sometimes not so well. Here are your typical white balance settings. Auto. Now for beginners, I generally recommend you start on auto. It's going to look at the scene and try to find the brightest, whitest area of the scene and balance according to that, but there's not always a bright white thing and it can easily be thrown off. Daylight. Daylight is based on direct sun at noontime. I say that specifically about noon because if you're shooting early in the day, later in the day, you may get a warmer color out of the sun. But I'd say when in doubt, shoot on daylight. You can always correct it later if you have shot in raw. Shade. This is for open shade. This doesn't mean under a dark tree, not that kind of shade, but if you're on the shady side of a building on a sunny day when the only thing you're going to be lit by is the reflected light off of a blue sky. So it's going to be for a bluer light and make the image warmer to correct for that. Cloudy. I generally don't recommend shooting on the cloudy setting. Clouds vary quite a bit from thin overcast to very heavy storm clouds. This is generally going to make your image warmer, and I feel like it generally makes it too warm. Tungsten. This is for your old school screw-in light bulbs, your incandescent light bulbs, which are a much warmer color. And then we have the fluorescent setting. This is for your just typical institutional fluorescent tubes. There are warmer and cooler different kinds of fluorescent lights. This is just kind of for the standard one. Flash happens to be exactly the same as daylight. And then we have custom. Obviously flash you'd shoot when you're shooting a flash. Custom is where you can shoot something that you know to be bright white. Let's say a white piece of paper, anything else that you trust to be a neutral white. And then you can tell the camera when you're in this mode to use that image to create a custom white balance based on that. Color temperature setting is where you can get in and set a specific Kelvin degree number. Kelvin degrees are a way of rating different color light sources. So if you happen to know that you're shooting under a light source that has 3850 Kelvin color temperature, you can set that specifically. Next, let's talk about metering mode. How does the camera determine what is the correct exposure? Well, the camera looks at the scene and looks at the frame, and depending on how you set this, it might value one part of the scene over another. Generally speaking, I would recommend using matrix, which is what Nikon calls it, or evaluative, which is what Canon calls it. Matrix or evaluative, in this case, the camera compares different zones, and it's basically looking at the brightest zone and the darkest zone and picking an exposure that kind of splits the difference. Center weighted is where the camera is going to take most of its readings from the center 30% of the frame. That does fairly well. Usually, we sort of expect that our main subject is in the middle of the frame, but this can easily be thrown off if you don't know what you're doing with it. Last is spot metering, and I would not recommend spot metering unless you really know what you're doing with it. But basically, spot metering is going to take 100% of its reading from the very narrowest 2 degree area of your frame. That's fine, by the way, if you happen to be pointing right at something that's middle gray, but oftentimes you're not, and it can really throw off your exposure. What about image quality? Now, you've probably heard of JPEG, and maybe you've heard of RAW image files. Your camera gives you the opportunity to photograph in one or the other, or both. I do not recommend shooting in JPEG. In fact, for this class, I require that you shoot in RAW. What we're looking at here is how Canon displays these different settings. These, with the letters, are all JPEG settings. JPEGs are a compressive file type, which I'll talk about in a second. The little curved line means that it's a higher quality compression, and the L means the size, the number of pixels, the number of megapixels that the image is rendered in. So this would be a fine and large quality JPEG, but a JPEG is still a poor file type relative to a RAW. So we're going to come all the way down here, and you're going to set your camera to photograph in RAW or RAW Plus. Now, RAW Plus means you're going to get a RAW image and a JPEG of every image that you shoot. On Nikon, this is where you're going to find it in an image quality menu, and you're looking for NEF RAW. NEF is simply Nikon's RAW format. It's their proprietary RAW format, but it is a RAW format nonetheless. If you see these things that say fine, normal, basic, or you're going to do RAW plus something, what that means is a different amounts of JPEG compression. And should you use one of those, I recommend that you use the fine. But for our class, you're going to be shooting in RAW or RAW plus. Now, why RAW? Well, RAW files have the most amount of data. They are unprocessed files. They are exactly what they say. They're all the raw light data that the camera initially captures. And that gives you a lot more data to edit and adjust and process your image later. It also allows you to change the settings of things like the white balance and the color space. These things are not burned into the image. The images are much larger, they take up more space, you get fewer images on a card, but it's well worth it. Buy a bigger card if you don't have enough space to shoot with RAW, or you're wishing that you could have more images on your card. That's a much better bargain than to switch to a JPEG. Now, why not JPEG? Why is JPEG so bad? Well, JPEG is designed for the internet, for web pages. It is a processed and compressed image file. It doesn't have as much data. Basically, your RAW file is developed by the camera into a much smaller file type. And in that compression process, you get a degradation of your image, and that results in artifacts, which you see here. These little blocky bits of detail, this kind of glitchy looking stuff, is what we call artifacts. And that's a process by which the JPEG is compressed in an algorithm, and it throws out little bits of image data and it writes other things in a shorthand, and you end up with that kind of look. Now, where can you find these settings on your camera? And now is your turn to actually go and find them. Can you find these things? Where do you find your exposure mode? When you find it, you're going to set it to manual. Well, hint, that's going to be in your exposure mode wheel at the top of the camera. Find your ISO, set it to 1600. Why 1600? Well, right now you're in an indoor space. We're going to do a little shooting exercise. We're going to have it on 1600 for your indoor space, but we would set it to much lower if you were going outdoors. White balance. Set it to auto, or whichever setting you feel is appropriate for your lighting. Look up above you. Are you under tungsten lights? Are you under fluorescent lights? Are you outdoors? That would change your white balance setting, but otherwise you can leave it on auto. Metering, let's set it to matrix or evaluative. Image quality, make sure you set it to RAW or RAW plus JPEG if you want to have 2 files for each image. And lastly, see if you can find in your menus your date and time setting and set the current time and date.